Every morning, millions of people wake up believing something is wrong with them. The drive is gone. The focus is fractured. Motivation feels like a muscle that simply stopped working. But what if nothing is broken? What if your brain has been trained quietly, systematically, to feel this way? The brain is not a moral judge. It doesn't care about your goals or your dreams. It adapts to what you repeatedly expose it to, and over time, those adaptations can silently rewire your motivation itself. Today, we're going to uncover how that happens and how to reverse it. One of the most damaging beliefs people carry is the idea that motivation is something you're either born with or you're not. That belief alone can shut down effort before it even begins. But from a neuroscience perspective, motivation is not a fixed personality feature. It's a learned and trained state of the nervous system. Your brain does not label you as lazy or driven. It simply adapts to patterns of behavior, reward, and effort that you repeat over time. At the center of motivation is dopamine, not pleasure itself, but the anticipation of effort leading to reward. Dopamine is released when your brain predicts that doing something challenging will be worth it. The key word here is predicts. That prediction is shaped entirely by past experience. If effort has consistently been followed by reward, dopamine rises before action, pulling you forward. If effort has repeatedly led to stress, failure, or no meaningful outcome, dopamine drops and motivation disappears. This is why motivation feels so personal, yet is deeply biological. The brain is a learning machine. It keeps a running record of what required energy and what paid off. Over time, that record becomes your internal drive system. You don't lack motivation. Your brain has learned that effort is either inefficient or unnecessary. Modern environments accelerate this learning in the wrong direction. Easy dopamine, constant stimulation, scrolling, instant rewards teaches the brain that reward should arrive without effort. When that happens, the neural circuits that link effort to reward weaken. Tasks that once felt manageable begin to feel heavy. Focus feels painful, starting feels overwhelming, not because you changed, but because your brain adapted exactly as it was designed to. Importantly, the brain does not distinguish between good and bad rewards. It only tracks frequency, intensity, and timing. High-intensity rewards delivered frequently and effortlessly reset the baseline of what feels motivating. As that baseline rises, normal effort-based activities work, learning, building skills, no longer generate enough dopamine to feel engaging. This is where people mistakenly conclude that something is wrong with them. But here's the hopeful part. Anything that is trained can be retrained. Motivation returns when the brain relearns a simple equation. Effort predicts reward. That process doesn't start with passion or inspiration. It starts with controlled discomfort. Small, deliberate acts of effort performed consistently, especially when they are not immediately rewarding, begin to restore dopamine signaling tied to action. Over time, the anticipation of effort itself becomes energizing again. This is why disciplined routines work even when motivation is low. Action precedes motivation, not the other way around. When you repeatedly show your nervous system that effort leads somewhere meaningful, even slowly, the brain updates its predictions. Dopamine begins to rise earlier, resistance decreases. What once felt impossible starts to feel automatic. Crucially, this process requires removing the false narrative of identity. Saying "I'm not motivated" turns a temporary neural state into a permanent self-concept. A more accurate statement is, "My brain has been trained by my environment and habits, and that means it can be trained differently." Motivation is not something you wait for. It's something you build through repetition, patience, and respect for how the brain actually works. When you stop judging yourself and start training your nervous system, motivation doesn't just come back. It becomes stable, reliable, and internally generated. The brain operates on contrast. It is not designed to feel the same level of excitement or motivation all the time. Instead, it constantly adjusts its internal baseline based on what you repeatedly experience. At the center of this adjustment is dopamine, a neuromodulator that governs drive, pursuit, and willingness to exert effort. When dopamine spikes too often and too easily, the brain compensates by lowering its baseline. This is not a flaw. It is a protective mechanism. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure. In reality, it is the chemical of wanting. It rises in anticipation of something meaningful and falls after reward is received. The problem emerges when the brain is exposed to high intensity rewards in rapid succession, notifications, endless content, hyper-palatable food, constant novelty. These repeated spikes teach the brain that reward should be intense, immediate, and effortless. When that happens, the nervous system recalibrates. The baseline dopamine level, the level you experience when nothing particularly stimulating is happening, drops. As the baseline drops, everyday activities begin to feel dull, draining, or even aversive. Work that once felt engaging now feels exhausting. Learning feels heavy, stillness feels uncomfortable. This is not because those activities lost value, but because the contrast between them and overstimulation has grown too large. This lowering of the dopamine baseline has a critical consequence. Motivation becomes fragile. The brain becomes less willing to initiate effort unless there is a guaranteed high-intensity payoff. Tasks without immediate reward no longer generate enough dopamine to overcome friction. The result is procrastination, avoidance, and a persistent sense of mental fatigue. Importantly, the brain does not need addiction-level stimulation for this process to occur. Mild but frequent overstimulation is enough. Short videos, rapid switching between tasks, constant background noise, all of these fragment attention and spike dopamine repeatedly throughout the day. Over time, the brain learns to expect constant input. When that input is removed, dopamine drops below baseline, producing restlessness and lack of drive. What makes this cycle difficult to detect is that it feels psychological, not biological. People describe it as burnout, boredom, or lack of discipline. But at its core, it is a neurochemical imbalance created by pattern, not character. The brain has simply adapted to what it was repeatedly given. The reversal of this process begins with understanding that dopamine baselines can rise, but only through restraint. Reducing stimulation, even temporarily, allows the nervous system to recalibrate. Periods of low stimulation, silence, single-task focus, physical effort feel uncomfortable at first because dopamine is low. That discomfort is not a signal to escape. It is a signal that the system is recalibrating. Over time, as high-intensity inputs are spaced out or removed, the baseline gradually rises. Activities that once felt boring begin to feel satisfying again. Focus returns. Effort becomes tolerable. This is not because dopamine spikes higher, but because the baseline itself has been restored. Crucially, this process does not require eliminating pleasure. It requires controlling timing and frequency. When rewards are earned after effort rather than consumed constantly, dopamine becomes associated with pursuit instead of consumption. The brain relearns that effort itself predicts reward. Repeated overstimulation doesn't destroy motivation. It trains the brain to expect too much, too fast. When that expectation is corrected, motivation reemerges naturally. Not as a surge of excitement, but as a steady, sustainable drive that no longer depends on constant stimulation. The brain is an efficiency machine. Its primary goal is not achievement or growth, it is energy conservation. Every decision, every action, every thought carries a metabolic cost. Over time, the brain learns which behaviors require effort and which ones deliver outcomes with minimal energy expenditure. This learning happens quietly, below conscious awareness, and it shapes what feels easy, hard, or not worth attempting at all. Convenience accelerates this learning. When solutions are instant, frictionless, and automated, the brain updates its internal model. Effort is unnecessary. Navigation without thinking, entertainment without seeking, food without preparation, answers without struggle. None of these are inherently harmful. The issue arises when convenience becomes the dominant pattern. The brain begins to associate effort with inefficiency and discomfort rather than progress. Dopamine plays a central role here. Dopamine is released not only by reward, but by the prediction that effort will lead to reward. When outcomes arrive without effort, dopamine is uncoupled from exertion. The brain stops releasing dopamine in anticipation of hard tasks because history has taught it that reward does not require strain. As a result, effort begins to feel unusually costly. Tasks that require sustained attention or physical work trigger resistance almost immediately. This resistance is often misinterpreted as laziness or lack of discipline. In reality, it is learned avoidance. The brain has adapted to a low-effort environment and now treats effort as a threat to efficiency. When you attempt something difficult, the nervous system responds with discomfort, distraction, and fatigue, not because the task is impossible, but because it violates the brain's learned expectation. Convenience also short-circuits problem-solving circuits. When answers are instantly available, the brain has fewer opportunities to engage in struggle-based learning. Neural pathways associated with persistence and frustration tolerance weaken from underuse. Over time, even small obstacles feel overwhelming. The threshold for discomfort drops and the urge to escape rises. This has a compounding effect on motivation. If effort consistently feels bad and unproductive, the brain learns to avoid it preemptively. Motivation disappears before action even begins. The mind searches for easier alternatives not because it is weak, but because it has been trained to optimize for comfort. The reversal of this process requires intentional reintroduction of friction. This does not mean seeking suffering for its own sake. It means allowing effort to be part of the process again. Delaying convenience, choosing manual over automatic, struggling briefly before seeking assistance. These small decisions retrain the brain's reward system. When effort is followed by progress, even slow progress, dopamine begins to realign with exertion. The brain relearns that effort is not wasted energy, but a reliable pathway to reward. Importantly, this retraining must be gradual. Too much friction too quickly can trigger avoidance. Small, repeatable challenges are enough to rebuild tolerance. Over time, effort stops feeling like a threat. It becomes familiar. The nervous system adapts, just as it adapted to convenience. What once felt exhausting begins to feel neutral, then manageable, and eventually satisfying. Convenience did not make you unmotivated. It trained your brain to conserve energy too effectively. When you deliberately reintroduce effort, you are not forcing discipline, you are updating the brain's prediction model. And when the brain learns that effort works again, motivation returns as a natural consequence. The brain does not respond to what you intend to do. It responds to what you repeatedly do. Over time, repeated behaviors carve neural pathways that determine which actions feel energizing and which feel draining. This process happens automatically, without conscious approval, and it is driven by one core principle. What gets repeated becomes reinforced. At the center of this reinforcement system is dopamine. Dopamine does not simply respond to pleasure. It encodes value. It teaches the brain what matters and what is worth pursuing again. Each time a behavior is followed by a dopamine release, the brain strengthens the circuit that led to it. Each time a behavior requires effort without meaningful reward, that circuit weakens. This is how habits quietly redefine your internal experience. If your habits consistently pair stimulation with ease, scrolling, snacking, multitasking, the brain learns that low-effort activities are valuable. In contrast, behaviors that require focus, patience, or delayed gratification begin to feel disproportionately costly. Not because they are objectively harder, but because the brain has assigned them lower reward value. Importantly, the brain does not distinguish between healthy and unhealthy habits. It only tracks frequency, consistency, and outcome. A habit performed daily with even a small reward can outweigh a habit performed occasionally with a larger payoff. This is why short, frequent behaviors have such outsized influence on motivation and mood. Over time, this conditioning shapes your subjective energy levels. Activities aligned with high reward habits feel light and inviting. Activities that compete with those habits feel heavy and exhausting. The fatigue you experience is not always physical or mental. It is often motivational fatigue, a signal that the brain expects little return on investment. This explains why people can feel energized by distractions yet depleted by meaningful work. The nervous system has learned where dopamine reliably comes from. When you attempt to shift behavior, the brain resists not because the new behavior is harmful, but because it threatens established reward circuits. The critical insight here is that habits do not just follow motivation, they create it. Waiting to feel motivated before changing habits reverses the actual order of operations. The brain updates motivation after behavior changes, not before. This is why small habit shifts can have disproportionate effects over time. Changing what feels rewarding begins with strategic repetition. When you repeatedly perform a challenging behavior and pair it with some form of acknowledgement, progress, tracking, completion, or even brief satisfaction, the brain begins to reassign value. Dopamine starts to rise earlier in the process, reducing resistance and increasing follow-through. Equally important is reducing the reward intensity of habits you want less of. This does not require elimination, it requires spacing. When high reward behaviors become less frequent or less immediate, their dominance over the reward system weakens. This creates room for new habits to gain traction. The brain is constantly ranking behaviors based on past outcomes. That ranking determines what feels exciting, boring, or exhausting. By deliberately choosing which habits you repeat, you are not relying on willpower. You are reshaping the reward hierarchy of your nervous system. Your habits are not just routines. They are training signals. And with enough repetition, they decide whether your life feels driven by effort or pulled forward by motivation. The nervous system evolved to keep you alive, not to help you reach your potential. As a result, it treats unfamiliar effort, uncertainty, and strain as potential threats. This is why discomfort often triggers an immediate urge to stop, escape, or distract. But from a neuroscience perspective, discomfort is not a warning sign, it is a training signal. When you experience discomfort during effort, whether physical, cognitive, or emotional, the brain is detecting a gap between current capacity and required output. That gap activates stress and alertness systems designed to mobilize energy. In small, controlled doses, this stress is not harmful. It is essential. It signals the brain that adaptation is needed. Dopamine interacts with this process in a critical way. During effortful activity, dopamine often dips initially. This dip is what makes effort feel hard at the beginning. However, when effort is sustained and followed by progress or completion, dopamine rebounds above baseline. Over time, the brain learns that discomfort predicts reward. That learning reshapes motivation itself. The problem arises when discomfort is consistently avoided. Avoidance teaches the brain that discomfort equals danger. Each time you escape effort through distraction or quitting, the brain reinforces a protective loop. The threshold for discomfort drops, and the urge to avoid rises. Eventually, even minor challenges trigger resistance. This avoidance loop is not conscious. It is encoded in the nervous system. The brain remembers that avoiding discomfort reduced stress in the short term, so it repeats the strategy. Over time, this leads to shrinking tolerance for effort and a growing sense of fragility around challenge. Growth requires interrupting this pattern, not through extreme hardship, but through voluntary exposure to manageable discomfort. When you choose to stay in effort slightly longer than feels comfortable, you send a powerful signal to the brain. This is safe and it works. That signal updates threat assessments and reward predictions simultaneously. Importantly, the goal is not to eliminate discomfort, but to reinterpret it. Discomfort does not mean something is wrong. It means the nervous system is being asked to adapt. When this reinterpretation becomes habitual, discomfort loses its emotional charge. It becomes information rather than a command to stop. This is why gradual progression matters. If discomfort is too intense, the brain categorizes it as danger and strengthens avoidance. If it is moderate and repeatable, the brain learns resilience. Over time, the same stimulus produces less stress and more confidence. This is neuroplasticity in action. Physical training illustrates this principle clearly. Muscles grow not in comfort, but in response to controlled strain. The brain follows the same rule. Cognitive and emotional capacities expand when they are challenged just beyond their current limits. The discomfort you feel is evidence that the system is being pushed into adaptation. Reframing discomfort also restores motivation. When the brain learns that discomfort reliably leads to improvement, dopamine begins to rise earlier in the effort process. Starting becomes easier, resistance weakens, what once felt threatening begins to feel purposeful. Discomfort is not your enemy. It is the nervous system's request for growth. When you learn to stay present with it without panic or avoidance, you stop training fragility and start training strength. And in that shift, motivation becomes durable, earned, and internally generated. Motivation is not a static trait or a permanent state. It is the product of the brain's predictive learning system, a system that continuously updates what is worth pursuing based on experience. At its core, motivation emerges when the nervous system reliably predicts that effort will produce meaningful outcomes. When that prediction falters, drive disappears. The key to regaining motivation is not force or willpower. It is retraining the brain to expect reward from effort again. The nervous system learns through repetition. Every time an action produces a positive outcome, the brain strengthens the connection between that behavior and reward. This is the essence of reinforcement learning. Dopamine plays a central role, signaling the brain to prioritize behaviors that lead to gain. However, modern environments often decouple effort from reward. Instant gratification, constant stimulation, and shortcuts teach the brain that reward can be obtained without exertion. Over time, circuits linking effort to positive anticipation weaken, leaving the individual feeling unmotivated and resistant to action. Relearning effort equals reward begins with small, deliberate challenges. The key is not intensity, but consistency. Actions that require effort, but are reliably followed by meaningful outcomes, send corrective signals to the brain. The nervous system begins to recalibrate, updating its predictions. Effort is not wasteful, effort is effective. As this recalibration occurs, dopamine signaling shifts. Anticipatory dopamine rises earlier in the process, making action easier to initiate. Resistance fades because the brain starts to see effort as a pathway to reward rather than a cost to avoid. This process is supported by structuring experiences to maximize predictable, controllable outcomes. When the brain can associate effort with clear, measurable progress, reinforcement is strongest. For example, setting achievable micro goals creates repeated opportunities for success. Each completion sends a proof of effort signal to the nervous system, strengthening motivation over time. In contrast, inconsistent or delayed feedback can prolong the low motivation state because the brain struggles to form reliable predictions. It is also essential to manage overstimulation during this relearning phase. Highly rewarding shortcuts or constant distractions can outcompete effort-based behaviors, slowing the retraining process. By reducing exposure to instant rewards like endless social media scrolling, frequent notifications, or mindless entertainment, the brain can focus on relearning the value of effort. The contrast between low-intensity, effortful tasks and previously high-intensity, effortless rewards allows dopamine baselines to normalize, making effortful tasks feel satisfying once again. Persistence is critical. The nervous system does not reset instantly. Motivation returns gradually through repeated cycles of controlled effort and reward. Early efforts may feel laborious and underwhelming. This is expected and normal. The key is consistency. The brain needs enough repeated experience to update its predictive model. Over weeks and months, those repeated efforts strengthen circuits that link effort to positive anticipation, creating a stable foundation for long-term motivation. Finally, internal narrative plays a subtle but powerful role. Believing I'm unmotivated reinforces the brain's prediction that effort is not worthwhile. Reframing this as my brain has learned an unhelpful pattern and I can retrain it shifts the system from judgment to learning. Motivation is not a mystery or a gift. It is a trainable neural process governed by repeated patterns of effort and reward. When the brain relearns that effort reliably predicts reward, motivation becomes sustainable, internally generated, and resilient to distraction. Resistance fades, focus strengthens, and actions that once felt daunting become part of your natural rhythm. Motivation is not something you wait for. It is something you rebuild, step by teaching your nervous system the fundamental rule it had forgotten. Effort leads to reward.